911, what's the emergency?
There's a guy unresponsive in the snow. I don't know if he's breathing.
He was found in the snow at 6 in the morning, face down on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts, January 29, 2022, a Sunday. The temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight. John O'Keefe was a Boston police officer, 46 years old. He had 2 black eyes, multiple skull fractures, abrasions on his right arm. He had been outside in that cold long enough that hypothermia had contributed to whatever killed him. He was unconscious when the first people reached him. He never regained consciousness. The woman who found him was Karen Reed, his girlfriend. She had driven to that address looking for him after a night that had started with drinks at 2 bars and ended with silence on the other end of a phone she had called more than 50 times. Within 3 days, she was arrested. Within 5 months, she was charged with second-degree murder. And within 3 years, what had begun as a straightforward case against a woman accused of hitting her boyfriend with her car and leaving him to die had become one of the most divisive and closely watched criminal trials in recent American history. A case about evidence and cover-ups and loyalty, and whether the people responsible for finding the truth had, from the very beginning, decided what the truth was going to be before they looked for it. The night before John O'Keefe was found, he and Karen Reed had been out with a group of friends. They went to 2 bars in the area, Waterfall Bar and Grill, and C.F. McCarthy's. By the time the evening ended, the group had been drinking for hours. The relationship between Reed and O'Keefe was not simple. They had been together for several years. The people who knew them described the relationship as sometimes warm and sometimes volatile, the kind of dynamic that looks fine from the outside until it doesn't. On the night of January 28th, there had been tension. The voicemails Reed left in the early morning hours. 8 of them, some of them angry, some of them the words of a woman who had been drinking and was trying to reach someone who was not answering, became a centerpiece of the prosecution's case. They were presented as evidence of a couple who had reached a breaking point. The defense presented them as evidence of a woman desperately trying to find a boyfriend who was already dying outside in the cold. Shortly after midnight on the morning of January 29th, Reed drove O'Keefe to 34 Fairview Road, the Canton home of Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer and friend of O'Keefe's. A gathering was still going on inside. Reed says she dropped O'Keefe off outside and drove away. She says she did not go inside. She says she assumed he was going in to continue the night with his friends. What happened between that moment and 6 in the morning is the question this entire case rests on. Reed drove home. She called O'Keefe repeatedly through the night and into the early morning. 53 calls, 8 voicemails. Some of the voicemails were angry, the product of a couple who had been fighting and drinking and the particular volatility that comes with both. None of them were answered. At some point before dawn, Reed drove back to Fairview Road with Jennifer McCabe, a friend who was the sister-in-law of Brian Albert. They found O'Keefe on the lawn, unconscious in the snow. He died at the hospital. The medical examiner determined he had died from blunt force trauma and hypothermia. Multiple skull fractures, 2 black eyes, abrasions on his right arm that, depending on which expert you were listening to, were consistent with either being struck by a vehicle or being attacked by a dog. The defense brought in forensic experts who testified that the pattern of marks on O'Keefe's arm was more consistent with a dog bite than with car debris. The Albert house had a dog. That detail became another thread in the defense's theory of the case, not a definitive answer, but an alternative that the jury was asked to sit with alongside everything else. Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor was assigned as the lead investigator. Proctor knew the Albert family. He had grown up in the same community. He had attended events at the Albert house. He had social and personal connections to the people who had been inside that house on the night O'Keefe died. Those connections, and what Proctor did and did not do in the early hours of the investigation, would become one of the central issues of the entire case. The defense argued from the beginning that Proctor's investigation had been pointed in one direction before it had properly examined the alternatives, that the house at 34 Fairview Road had never been searched for blood, fingerprints, or DNA on the night O'Keefe was found. That critical evidence had either been missed or ignored, that the investigation, from its earliest hours, had been built around a conclusion rather than conducted in search of one. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Karen Redd had hit John O'Keefe with her Lexus SUV in the driveway or on the road outside that house and driven away, leaving him to die in the cold. Evidence they pointed to: pieces of broken taillight found at the scene that matched Reed's vehicle. The abrasions on O'Keefe's arm, which they argued were consistent with contact with a car. Reed's blood alcohol level, which was above the legal limit that morning. And Redd's own behavior, the voicemails, the calls, what they characterized as the conduct of a woman who had been in a volatile relationship and had reached a breaking point. The defense looked at the same set of facts and constructed a completely different picture. They argued that O'Keefe had never been struck by Reed's vehicle, that he had been attacked inside the Albert house, where a gathering had been ongoing, that his body had been moved to the front lawn after the fact, that the evidence at the scene had been manipulated to make it look like he had been hit by a car and died outside, and that the investigation, led by a trooper with personal ties to the Albert family, had been corrupted from the beginning, designed not to find out what happened to John O'Keefe, but to protect the people inside that house while building a case against Karen Redd. Two pieces of evidence became the center of everything. The first was the taillight fragments. Pieces of red and clear plastic from a broken taillight were found at the scene. Proctor confirmed they matched Reed's Lexus. The defense argued those fragments had been planted, that they appeared at the scene under suspicious circumstances, that the timeline of their discovery did not hold up, and that Proctor, who admitted he had not searched the inside of the Albert house for blood, fingerprints, or DNA evidence on the night O'Keefe was found, had allowed the investigation to point in only one direction. The second was the Google search. Jennifer McCabe's phone contained a search for "hose long to die in cold," a typing error. The search was real. The question was when it had been made. Prosecutors said McCabe had made the search the morning O'Keefe's body was found, at Redd's direction, after they discovered him on the lawn. The defense said the metadata on McCabe's phone showed the search had been made at 2:27 in the morning, hours before anyone had officially found O'Keefe, hours before there was any public reason to be searching for how long a person could survive in the cold. This is the case ledger. If this is your first time here, we follow evidence. We don't protect powerful people. We don't move on until the case moves. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next in this one. If the defense was right about that timestamp, it meant someone inside or connected to that house had known O'Keefe was outside in the cold before the rest of the world did. It meant the Google search was not a response to finding a body. It was something else entirely. Digital forensics experts testified on both sides. The prosecution's experts said the 2:27 timestamp was not accurate. The defense's experts said it was. Two credentialed professionals, two conclusions. The jury was left to decide which one to believe. Then came Michael Proctor. Proctor was the lead investigator. He was a prosecution witness. He was supposed to be one of the pillars of the state's case. And when he took the stand, the case began to come apart in ways that nobody inside the prosecution had fully anticipated. Under cross-examination, Proctor admitted to sending a series of text messages about Karen Reed in a private group chat with colleagues. The messages referred to her as a whack job. They contained a comment that he had found no nudes while searching her phone for evidence. They were dismissive, contemptuous, and deeply unprofessional from the man responsible for leading an objective investigation. Defense attorneys laid each message out in front of the jury and asked Proctor about it directly. He admitted to sending them. Proctor also admitted he had not searched the interior of the Albert house on the night O'Keefe was found. He admitted there were gaps in his investigation that he could not fully account for. He admitted to procedural decisions that, under cross-examination, he struggled to explain in a way that sounded like objective police work. The jury in the first trial deadlocked, a hung jury, a mistrial. The state announced it would retry the case. The decision was controversial. Reed's attorneys had argued that retrying her would constitute double jeopardy, that the jury had effectively acquitted her on the most serious charges before the mistrial was declared. That argument went to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which ruled against Red. The retrial would proceed. The second trial began in April 2025. By the time it concluded, the same evidence had been argued again, the same witnesses had testified again, and the same core question had been put to a new jury. On June 18, 2025, after 4 days of deliberations, that jury reached a verdict. Karen Red was acquitted of second-degree murder, acquitted of manslaughter, acquitted of leaving the scene of a crash resulting in death. She was found guilty only of operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. She received 1 year of probation. Outside the courthouse, Reed was surrounded by supporters who had been following the case for 3 years. Many of them were wearing pink, the color that had become associated with her defense throughout the trials. Social media had made this case into something larger than a local murder trial. The hashtags, the daily live streams, the commentators who had spent months analyzing every piece of testimony. She had become, for a significant portion of the American public who had followed the case, something more than a defendant. She had become a symbol of what it looks like when an ordinary person is placed in the path of an institutional machinery that has decided what the answer is before it begins asking the questions. For the O'Keefe family, the acquittal meant something entirely different. It meant that the person they believed was responsible for John's death had walked out of a courtroom without being held accountable. The verdict did not answer the question of what had happened to John O'Keefe. It only answered the question of whether the state had proven its case against Karen Reed. Those are not the same thing. Michael Proctor did not survive the verdict intact. In March 2025, before the second trial concluded, he was fired from the Massachusetts State Police. The firing came after findings that his conduct during the investigation had violated department policy in multiple respects. The man who had led the investigation into John O'Keefe's death was terminated from the agency he had worked for, while the second trial into that death was still underway. In November 2025, Karen Reed filed a civil lawsuit. The defendants named in the filing included Proctor, his former supervisors, and 5 people who had been inside the Albert house on the night O'Keefe died: Brian and Nicole Albert, Jennifer and Matthew McCabe, and former ATF agent Brian Higgins. The lawsuit alleged malicious prosecution, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and intentional misconduct. It alleged that rather than call first responders for help, those inside the house had conducted a Google search for how long it takes to die in the cold, moved O'Keefe's body outside, and placed him on the front lawn near the road to make it look like he had been hit by a vehicle. It alleged that Proctor and his colleagues had allowed those inside the house to direct the investigation away from themselves and toward Reed. It stated that Red had accumulated millions of dollars in legal debt defending herself against charges she was ultimately acquitted of. Proctor filed a formal response in January 2026. He denied the conspiracy allegations. He denied planting evidence. He admitted to observing the cracked taillight on Reed's vehicle and to procedural decisions that had drawn scrutiny. He denied that any of it constituted the corrupt and biased investigation Reed's team described. The civil case is ongoing. John O'Keefe's brother Paul had filed his own wrongful death lawsuit in August 2024, naming Red, along with the 2 bars where the group had been drinking on the night of January 28th. That lawsuit remained active through the acquittal and beyond. The 2 cases sit alongside each other, one saying Red killed O'Keefe, one saying she was framed for a death she had nothing to do with. John O'Keefe was 46 years old. He had been a Boston police officer for more than 2 decades. He had been found in the snow outside a colleague's home with 2 black eyes and multiple skull fractures. He had 2 nieces and a nephew he had been raising after the deaths of their parents. The exact sequence of events that put him on that lawn has never been officially established. No one has been charged in connection with what the defense argued actually happened inside that house on the night of January 28th and the early morning of January 29th. The investigation that was supposed to answer those questions was led by a man who had been sending contemptuous text messages about the defendant from the very beginning, who had personal connections to the family at the center of the defense's theory, and who was ultimately fired from the agency he worked for over his conduct in the case. 3 years, 2 trials, 1 acquittal, millions of dollars in legal debt for a woman who was ultimately convicted only of drunk driving. A lead investigator fired from his own department, a civil lawsuit that names 8 defendants and alleges a cover-up that began in the early hours of January 29, 2022, and continued through 2 criminal trials, and a Google search made at 2:27 in the morning that nobody has fully explained. What it means for John O'Keefe, what it means for who is responsible for what happened to him on that front lawn in Canton, Massachusetts, is a question that a courtroom has not answered and may never answer. The snow that morning covered everything. Some of what it covered has never been recovered. And until it is, 2 families are left living in the space between 2 versions of the same night. One that ends with a woman behind the wheel, one that ends with a body moved to a lawn before the sun came up.